Okay, so I've just been to a webinar with Scottish CND, and I wanted to make this video because I feel that there is a credible amount of naivety on the basis of misinformation, half-truths that people are putting across. And yeah, that's a big problem. I feel it needs to be addressed. So yeah, I'd like to show a few clips from what people have said and maybe make a few comments on them. So this meeting had three speakers: Isabel Lindsay, Barry Hebb, Almut Rojavansky. That's not very good pronunciation, I don't think. So they're particular experts in certain areas. Barry Hebb has been in Ukraine and has assessed the damage to infrastructure, society, and so on from the war on Ukraine. So presented quite a lot of very sad data about what the effect on Ukraine is, which I think has probably been underestimated by a lot of people. Alma Rojavansky, she calls herself an activist, but she was basically saying that the whole idea of increasing spending on the military is a bad idea. Yet I didn't get any useful insight as to what the alternatives would be, and I think a lot of people who asked questions also didn't get any useful information on that too. I apologise for the poor quality of the webcam here, but I just wanted to play a couple of clips from this webinar. I could probably share my screen as well, but I won't do that just now. But I'll just play the clip. And this is Isabel Lindsay. She's obviously a committed peace campaigner, which is obviously it is obviously a very helpful thing to be. Everyone wants peace, but I think you'll probably find that the cost of peace that is being suggested is really quite high. So let me just play you this little clip of what she was saying here, and then I want to make a couple of comments on it.
As the complete inadequacy, that's not strong enough word, I think almost negligence among the leaders of most of the NATO countries in trying to find peaceful solutions rather.
So she has this idea that all our leaders, she hasn't said exactly who she's talking about here, are completely inadequate in finding peaceful solutions. Now, if that's on the face of it sounds perfectly okay, I would certainly argue that there needs to be peace. However, this is a very naive and potentially very dangerous way to think about this war, because that assumes that both sides are equally willing to achieve peace, and both sides have grievances, valid grievances that need to be addressed. And I would argue that a dictatorship that has invaded another country for absolutely no reason, only on the pretense that NATO shouldn't have expanded their borders, that is a very dangerous place to go. And so, let me just play a little bit more of her speech.
That just say, here's more weapons.
Yeah, so Isabel is obviously not of the opinion that we should increase defence spending in Europe. However, that is fair enough. However, what are the alternatives? Presumably, the alternative is peace, which obviously anybody would want. However, just how likely is that to be possible to achieve a workable peace with a dictator who continuously lies, who just puts out propaganda the whole time, and is already at war with us? They're sabotaging our infrastructure, they're murdering our civilians, and they're lying about it. We know that Russia was responsible for the Salisbury poisonings. We know that Russia ordered the downing of MH17 or was complicit in it, and they tried to cover it up. We know that Russia has bombed civilians in Syria. So, and they tried to cover that up as well. They've used white phosphorus in the war on civilians in Syria. So, I find it very difficult to believe that you could have an honest conversation with this regime. However, there's no reason not to try that. That part of it, I do agree with her, but you must be under no illusions that a weak Western position will get you the peace deal that you actually want. So, it goes on.
And finally, I want to consider what should be done next after, if there is a ceasefire of sorts. But starting with the first point, I can remember the enthusiastic mood in many ways, despite all the problems in the 90s, terrible conditions in the former Soviet Union, and certainly on the Russian side. But I can remember the enthusiasm looking to be building new security structures in Europe. We had the Organisation for Security, Peace and Security in Europe. We had all kinds of different initiatives. And it looked fairly positive on change, but that didn't happen. And I'd like to quote here the former NATO General Secretary, George Robertson, who was also the former British Defence Secretary, whom I knew for years. And George was always a very, very loyal Atlanticist. But he said in an interview, this was in July 22, a radio interview, and he was commenting on the fact that he thought there was progress being made. There was an initiative for a Russian NATO Council that had been set up, and he thought there was progress, but he went on to say the policy of building closer relationships with Russia was opposed by the United States. It was not pursued. Now, you could understand why there were some in the US establishment who didn't want the idea of this much stronger European bloc, shall we say, incorporating, and where the treaties, the old status quo was more attractive. But he said that put the block on a lot of what might have been cooperative action. And he also went on to say that he thought NATO was mistaken in stating its support for Ukraine and Georgia's membership in principle of NATO, which was in 2008 that they did this.
Yeah, so I want to make a comment on the alleged NATO membership position, but let's just let her finish and see what her point is.
And we just have to remember some of this, I think irrational, but how do you think the US would feel if Canada, Mexico, Panama might suddenly feel that perhaps it would be useful to have Chinese or Russian missile bases on their border? Of course. I was old enough to be active during the Cuban crisis.
Yeah, now, this I find absolutely disgraceful comment. So Isabel is basically trying to deduce from a supposed problem that the US would have with another country on their border having Russian weapons or some sort of Russian assistance on their land. Now, we can only speculate what the US would do in a particular circumstance, and whether or not we agree or disagree with that is totally up to us. But the decision on that would lie totally with the US. We would not try and make a decision for another country on their behalf. But worse than this, I think it is absolutely outrageous to equate the situation that Ukraine is in compared to some hypothetical situation that the US is not in at all. And there was a Cuban Missile Crisis that was resolved peacefully. So she's also saying that Ukraine and Georgia were promised NATO membership in 2008. Now that is true informally of the Bush administration. However, what she also fails to mention is that 4 years before this, in 2004, we have video of Putin on TV saying basically that he had no problem with Ukraine joining NATO. He was saying that he would, he probably wouldn't be in favour of it, but it would not cause them any problems, and that because they're an independent sovereign state, that's within their own right, within it is a decision that they themselves would make. Now that is undeniable evidence that in 2004 Russia had no problem with this at all. So you can deduce from that this idea that Russia has had a problem with NATO encroachment on their borders as a total fallacy. And it is. We know for a fact that Russia is not interested in NATO countries on its borders. It's seen two countries since its illegal war joining NATO. Now, Finland has a bigger border than practically any country that's a NATO member, or what you see as part of the Western alliance. And we saw barely a whimper from Russia on that issue. Did they make any huge complaints? No, they didn't. So we now, it seems extremely far-fetched to now believe that Russia somehow has a big problem with Ukraine having NATO membership when they were perfectly fine before. And in fact, Gorbachev said clearly that it was never an issue that was ever a problem or discussed. So, you can't suddenly change your mind and use that as reason for an illegal invasion of another country. This is a total fallacy, and it's making excuses for dictators, which is not acceptable at all. So, Isabel, just go on a bit more.
But this is what did happen. So we had all that theory.
Yeah, it is what did happen, but it's only part of what happened, as I've explained. So let's have the full information for people to make their own mind up, rather than just cherry picking parts of it. That's my opinion anyway.
To take positive opportunities that happened in the 20 years or so beforehand. So that's a context. Now, when we come to the period after the war, there were two particular opportunities that we might have had a chance of peace. Perhaps a bit messy, but nevertheless a peace. And one was in March, April. This is well documented now, has been analysed quite intensively. But March, April, where we had direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And Turkey played an important role here, hosted in April Istanbul conference, and they did get to the stage where they did have agreements on paper, lots of discussions, and then that came to nothing. Now, there may have been various reasons for that, but one that the leader of the Ukrainian delegation later said was because they had these various European leaders, but particularly Boris Johnson, the awful Boris Johnson.
I don't know where to begin, really, with the naivety and misleading information that this lady is putting out. And the fact is that the negotiations in early 2022 basically amounted to Ukraine capitulation, as far as we understand anyway, because the details haven't been publicly published. And now, Boris Johnson was our Prime Minister, obviously, for some time, and he has a perfect right to speak on these issues, and he's been very supportive of Ukraine. But really, assigning one person to the failure of peace talks, which Ukraine rejected anyway, is absolutely absurd. I mean, I just don't know where she's getting this information from, but unfortunately, in this respect, there's quite a lot of misleading information going around, so it's probably not unexpected.
When to Kyiv and said, "Oh, you mustn't give in, brave fighters, we'll back you to the hilt."
I mean, I don't know where to really begin with this lady's attitude. Talking about brave fighters in such a off-putting way. She's dismissing people's thoughts and feelings on this matter in a really disgraceful way. And I only hope that we never ever come to war in this country with any other country. I want more than anything peace with every nation, but we have to understand clearly what the Ukrainians are fighting for. They're fighting for their futures, they're fighting for our futures, because Russia has quite clearly said, this is not controversial at all, that it wants to recreate the Soviet Empire. That's just basically what they want to get out of this war, as well as, either overrunning a country or having political control, total influence over that country, as they do in Belarus, effectively making a vassal state out of another country. So that is basically what they want to do. So to talk about Ukrainian defenders in this manner is really very strange to me. But this shows really that not everybody is cognizant of all the facts of this situation. And different people obviously come from different points of view, but let's go on anyway and see what else she has to say.
And that was one of the elements in Kyiv's decision to withdraw from that. But then we had at the end.
So she admits it was one of the elements. But, she doesn't actually tell us that the main element in that was just that they wanted Ukraine to totally capitulate to Russia. So that's missing out a quite important fact. If your neighbour came round and said, "Oh, I want to take half of your land, but we can do a peace deal. All that involves you taking 75% of the land. You okay with that?" So, who in their right mind would ever agree to something like this? It's completely absurd. People have to stand up for their rights. That's my belief, and that's exactly what Ukraine is doing, and what we'll continue to support them doing.
Of 2022, we had Mark Milley, who was chair of the US Chief of Staff, was asked by Biden to prepare a report on the Ukraine situation, and he came back and he said, "Look, Ukraine has been more successful than we thought in holding the line." But he said, as far as he was concerned, they were at peak success in doing that, and that he saw things going downhill along the way after that, and just a perpetuation of destruction and killings, and coming out in a worse position. He prepared that report that was submitted to the president, and Biden slapped him down.
Yeah, so this report from Mark Milley, that's fair enough, but to characterise it as Biden slapped him down is again very odd. So the idea here that Ukraine was at a peak in 2022 wasn't going to progress any further. They've retaken Kherson region. They've also invaded Russia. They've inflicted horrendous casualties on Russia, over 800,000, and they've massively weakened the Russian war machine. If that is a nation that peaked in 2022, then I find that a very odd comment to make. This is simply fantasy.
So that was another opportunity that was neglected. And since then, we've had really nothing over those years from the leaders in the European NATO countries. We haven't had real efforts at negotiation. We just said, we'll give you more weapons, we'll give you more weapons.
Okay, so this seems to be the idea here again, that we're ignoring peace, that we shouldn't be arming Ukraine. So this is a war that Ukraine wants to continue. They feel they have no choice. They feel that their values of freedom and democracy are worth fighting for. They don't want to be subjugated to Russia. So I don't understand why she thinks that peace is something that is going to be achieved in the near future. This just seems total fantasy. If there were genuine negotiations, both sides had the same willingness to discuss issues in good faith, then that would be fair enough. Obviously, nobody wants war. Well, nobody in the West wants war either. But we do have to understand that Russia is not like a normal country. As John McCain said, it's a gas station masquerading as a country. So let's just continue a little bit, see what else she has to say.
And keep on going, you brave people. And the result of this has been just more and more deaths.
Well, obviously, I agree that continuing the war has resulted in more casualties on both sides, mainly on the Russian side, but any Ukrainian death is an absolute tragedy. However, this is again a war that Ukraine still wants to continue with, and that is a decision of who are we to argue with them, really. Do we somehow think that their belief in values isn't as strong as ours? I really don't understand this idea that she has.
More and more destruction, and at the end of the day, not the prospect of any better settlement that might have been achieved if some of these early initiatives had been taken.
So again, this is totally naive and also totally wrong. So the initial suggestion was total capitulation to Russia, and the prospect for a just peace at the moment, given that Russia has hardly moved 20, 30 miles further into Ukraine over the last year, is not significantly any different to what it was 2 years ago. In fact, after the so-called 2022 peace negotiations, which were obviously a total waste of time, really, because Russia was not willing an honest participant in those talks. So let's just finish what she's got to say.
And the final point I want to make is, if there is a ceasefire, which we hope, but if there is a ceasefire, then what should we be doing then? And the thing which has been so appalling just in the past few weeks is that all we're hearing from the NATO European states is, we must spend more on defence, we'll have to increase our defence, more weapons. That's all we've been hearing. Whereas the one thing they should have been saying is that if there is a ceasefire, we will create a major reconstruction fund for Ukraine.
Yes, this is a complete misnomer as well. Many countries have already committed hundreds of billions of pounds or dollars to the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. However, that is something which needs to be dealt with when the war is won, and not the time when the war is being fought. Therefore, to talk about not increasing military spending at a stage when we are under severe threat from a hostile nation. They're attacking our critical infrastructure, murdering our civilians. They're continually committing environmental destruction, and that will only get worse. That will only get worse with Russia's dodgy fleet of shadow tankers. That is a reality of the war that Russia is committing on the whole of Europe, and in fact the whole world, because any of these unfit tankers from the shadow Russian fleet could spill oil anywhere in the world, create an environmental catastrophe there. Russia will obviously say, "Oh, nothing to do with us. It wasn't a Russian tanker." So that's basically what we have from the mafia state. Now, on the Western side, we do need to increase our spending on defence. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because any spending on defence is it's not really productive to a country, because obviously we'd much rather be spending on things which help people, health service, education, transport, etc. But we have to live with the reality that not only are there sometimes valid conflicts, but sometimes there are rogue operators like Russia, which is basically a mafia state. And these threats need to be countered for the security of all of us. So this is a reality. We're suffering increased threats from Russia. They're continually testing our defences by sending ships, aeroplanes close to UK borders to test our defences. They're intentionally cutting cables, so far mainly in between northern European countries, but it will happen closer to us in the future as well. That is an absolute certainty, I believe. They've also attacked the head of Rheinmetall in Germany. They tried to murder him. They've unfortunately murdered several of of our citizens, and we've basically done nothing apart from giving them a little slap on the wrist to say, please don't do it again. There's been no repercussion to them. They've hijacked Western planes. A Ryanair flight was basically hijacked to take a Russian dissident back. They've poisoned their own people. People are falling out of windows more in Russia now, presumably opponents of the Russian regime. This is just a lawless state. You cannot treat it like any sensible, democratic, or state which has any freedoms, really. It's just a totally different country to deal with, and the failure to understand that in the fact that they're already waging war on us. There's an information war. They've also disrupted our critical infrastructure in the IT area as well. We've had companies hacked by Russian bad actors. And I could go on about the dangers from Russia. We should never underestimate these dangers. We just have lived in a peaceful, mostly peaceful world for so long that we see the dangers of war as being very low when we're already at war in this country, unfortunately. They've given us no choice, but we have to respond. And if that involves increasing military spending, then that's what it'll have to be. Because Russia has basically built it is on a wartime footing. The spending on Russian defense officially is about 6%, but in practice it's more like at least double that. So this is what we have to face, and we have no choice. It's nobody in this webinar has been able to offer any choice other than saying, "Oh, let's negotiate peace with this country." And if they were amenable to peace, obviously, I would be quite happy to do that, and I would be a first in line to offer my services to do that. But this is not a normal country that can be negotiated with on any level. And Americans, who this lady is talking about quite a lot in a critical way, should also realise that the Americans who have negotiated with the Russians previously think exactly the same, as that they know that Russia is not a state that you can negotiate with, and then you can negotiate something and they will abide by it. It's just unfortunately not the way that they work. So there's
so that we can start putting those resources, that money, into rebuilding and trying to create out of the mess a successful society. And the interesting thing about that is that would be a challenge to Russia, because on the assumption that Russia may come out with more territory, or at least certainly some of what was Ukrainian territory, but if there's
this I find absolutely disgraceful that Russia will come out with some advantage, having started a war of a sovereign nation. They will get anything for that. Completely undermines rule of law that the West has built over the last 80 years. That is totally alien to me.
The successful reconstruction, rebuilding, if there's success in Ukraine, then Russia's going to be under pressure. Isn't it?
I find it quite astonishing that this lady is concerned about the difficulty that Russia might have in rebuilding parts of Ukraine it's stolen from them. I mean, I cannot understand that. So we should have some concern for the invading country. For some reason, I don't understand that at all. I find it disgraceful.
What's it going to do? Is it going to fail people there? And I say this as a reminder that the former Soviet Union didn't collapse because there were military rebellions. It collapsed because there were more and more of its public who felt that they weren't achieving the quality of life that could be achieved, that they thought existed elsewhere in other parts of Europe. It was that lack of faith, that lack of conviction that eventually eroded the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, now this I do agree, at least to a certain extent, with the lady. I don't have any problem with that. So let me just play you a little bit of the speech from Barry Hebb, who was very interesting.
The introduction to this is that often in mass media, one of my disappointments is that if usually we focus on the cost of war being like the military budget, like $60 billion in the military budgets, or we look at the human casualty rates, the number of people who are killed or injured. This is really limited. It doesn't capture the deeper extent of the human suffering and deprivation that people actually experience. But I wanted to present, I'll try to keep it within the 10 to 15 minute range, some actual preliminary data just to give you some idea about the extent of suffering that people are enduring as a result of this ongoing war. And let me see, go next slide. I was thinking over the weekend, where would I like to start with this? It's difficult to know what people would be interested in. So I thought I'd start with one of my favorite authors, dissident authors about the anti-nuclear movement, Andrei Sakharov. And he wrote a book called Alarm and Hope. And
yes, that's interesting to know about the nuclear history. Just go on a little bit to talk about the civilian casualties, direct harm to civilians from conflict and war in Ukraine, killed 12,605, injured 29,178. I mean, obviously, each of those is a story in itself, and every one is a tragedy. Then Barry went on to talk about the lives of Ukrainians and the level of deprivation within Ukraine, which is, of course, a fact. I would argue that obviously the Russian invasion is doing damage to that economy as well. However, Russia is also wanting to deprive Ukraine of EU membership at some stage. And although that would obviously happen for quite some time, if that was a unchangeable path that Ukraine was on, it's difficult to underestimate the psychological impact on Ukrainians. That's in addition to the obviously positive economic impact that would eventually have. So, then Barry went on to talk about the relief on people in the conflict, which has obviously increased massively since 2021, and the number of people fleeing to other countries. That's an obvious fact as well, that many people have left Ukraine. Some will go back, some might never go back. But this is a situation. He's also recorded the number of refugees in different countries. Germany has the highest number. It's 1.2 million of Ukrainian refugees. I could share the screen. Sorry, I can't share the screen because that's on my video player. Okay, let's go on. I want to try and close this fairly soon. So finally, we had Almut Rochovansky, who's an activist. Let's hear a bit about what she has to say now.
Please introduce yourself. My name is Almut Rochovansky. I am an activist. I'm also now, because of this war and in the course of this war, I have sort of moved back to what I originally did, which is international relations analysis, because I came to understand that I couldn't practically and safely do grassroots activism, including with like women's groups in Ukraine, if the state of the world is such as it is. There's just no space for it. And I also wanted to thank Barry for all this data, because I think all of you here should understand the things that you've just seen. This is like copyright Barry head. Nobody else has seen this yet, this kind of analysis. You're being treated to a really unique and very useful, if very sad reality here. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of where do we stand with war and peace right now, and it connects to what both Barry and Isabel have talked about. And I want to start by reminding some of you here, maybe with us about a year ago.
Just move on a little bit to a couple of bits I wanted to highlight.
5, they will have recovered, and they will do another offensive, counteroffensive, and this time there was a consensus in expert communities, not a consensus, but sort of a daring idea that, okay, maybe 2024 will be a bad year for Ukraine, but in 2025 they will have recovered and they will do another offensive, counteroffensive, and this time they will be successful. And I thought back then that this is completely absurd, in military terms. And I think, but now we can see like how intellectually and also morally bankrupt this approach was.
So the idea is from this lady that Ukraine is not able to do counteroffensives now. Clearly that's totally wrong. The cursed counteroffensive, which almost nobody predicted, that was an extremely successful operation from last year. So it is true that the movements on the front lines are generally fairly low, but you can't underestimate the amount of resistance that Ukrainian soldiers are put up against incessant Russian attacks throughout that whole time. So, yeah, I don't quite agree with that.
Diplomacy is not a thing. It never works. All or most wars end in one side's victory. We've been told that diplomacy is just the same as appeasing war criminals. And we've been told that Russia, especially Russia more than any other country, can never be trusted and breaks all its international agreements. Now, all of this, of course, is nonsense.
Yeah, but unfortunately, all of that is not nonsense, as I found out. So, when I asked, if we could have an example of an agreement that Russia hasn't broken, I was hit with a deafening silence. So I'm afraid we have to come to the conclusion that there is no alternative to this, and that Russia is not honest in any negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and negotiate, but we should be realistic in understanding this country. So that's what I think. Let me just play a little bit more speech.
About this for decades. I mean, humans have been thinking of peace, obviously, for as long as there's been humanity. But for the last decades, we've made a very concerted effort to study peacemaking and to get better at it, just to develop sort of like the state-of-the-art peacemaking. And we can now say, bad Trump, he has thrown out all these lessons. But in reality, as we've already mentioned, this has been going on for 3 years. All of our governments and all of the governments we've recently voted out of office in Europe have not paid attention to this. They all threw out these lessons. Because if we dismiss peace processes in general, on the whole, then there's also no room for talking about peace as a state-of-the-art thing. How do you do peace well? There's another reason why the Trump approach may not work. A few days ago, I heard from Thomas Graham, who's one of the leading American diplomat experts in relations with Russia, spent a long time working for the State Department in Russia. And he has been conducting track 2 diplomacies, as a private, now retired individual. He has been traveling to Russia and meeting with interlocutors, and they are telling him, and it sounds very likely, that the Russians are actually worried that the Trump team, although it is now sort of open to talking, has nobody on the team that is actually a Russia expert. By that, they don't mean somebody who's read all of Dostoevsky. They mean somebody who knows the Cold War and post-Cold War history of Russian US engagement and failure of engagement. And so they feel that, whoever they're talking to doesn't really understand where they're coming from. So there are a lot of layers in this why things could not pan out well.
Yeah, well, I agree with her actually that the Trump negotiations will go nowhere. So yeah, there was a little bit of discussion afterwards as well. A few questions were answered, but I think overall the sort of summary of this meeting was that there was an incredible amount of naivety amongst several of the speakers. And this idea that there's going to be a ceasefire and that nothing will happen, just rebuild Ukraine straight away is really totally untenable. We have to allow Ukraine to get the security guarantees that they need before we can even think about rebuilding. We need to make sure that Russia can never invade a country again. So until that's gone, until that's resolved, there's very little point trying to negotiate. At the moment, it appears that the Trump negotiations are talking about total capitulation almost of Ukraine. Obviously that's never going to be accepted by the Ukrainians. So in that respect, I do think that there's, I agree with that. So I wanted just to do this live stream today on the third anniversary of the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, just to show people that although the majority of people in the West are supporting Ukraine and they're properly informed about the situation, particularly their attitude towards Russia, which is based upon the past history, that there are still some people who, obviously everyone is anti-war, as anti-war as Ukrainians. I don't think anybody wants war. No sane person will want to go to war. Sometimes it happens because there's reasonable differences, different opinions. Sometimes it happens for no obvious reason, and the aggressor state, as we saw with World War II, the aggressor state basically lies, doesn't honour their agreements. The fact that exactly the same thing is happening now as happened before World War II is very concerning to everyone. It should be very concerning to everyone in Europe. But we didn't see in the West the threat from Russia fully when they first invaded in 2014. We're seeing it more now. Our reaction has been too slow. We haven't committed enough resources. Alexa, stop! Take the rubbish out in the wild. Anyway, what was I saying? On this third anniversary, I just wanted to make people aware that there are some who are not as knowledgeable in some areas, particularly in their naivety towards Russia and the ability of a sustainable peace to be negotiated anytime soon. So, in the absence of that credible, sustainable peace, there really is no alternative but to increase our defence spending, and that's something which has been confirmed unfortunately by the speakers here, who I would have hoped would have been able to come up with credible alternatives. Unfortunately, nobody has really done anything to assuage my concerns in that respect. They have basically just offered half truths, misleading information, and that's how I feel that webinar has went. But yeah, I thought it would be useful for people who are supporting Ukraine to be at least aware of the types of arguments that people are coming up with, so they're more prepared, and they can hopefully contribute towards putting these people right where they can, because yeah, nothing against healthy discussion and debate with anybody, but we have to be honest with ourselves if we're going to try and get a just peace. And unfortunately, some people have deluded themselves into thinking that there's some viable peace that is just waiting there to be grasped, that it's all Europe's or all America's fault. We've not managed to do that. Yeah. Whereas in actual reality, the fault is all one country, and it's the one that is currently waging a illegal war on Ukraine and needs to have our continued support to be able to get out of this bad situation eventually, and hopefully build a peaceful and prosperous nation for themselves in the future. So yeah, okay, well, thanks for listening. Good night, everyone.